Where on earth could Dick be? Jen pulled off her overseas uniform cap and pushed back the damp brunette ringlets that clustered on her forehead. The April sun shone bright and clear. The green water lapped at the land, but it was hot. Bermuda, she reflected, might be paradise for honeymooners, but for the stewardesses who worked a flight down from New York, served 60 passengers a 3-course lunch, laid over 50 minutes at Kindley Field, and prepared a hot dinner on the return trip, Bermuda was nothing but a milk run. Why had Dick phoned operations to make sure she hadn't been canceled from this flight? A sense of trouble, foreign to the sunny afternoon, filled her. It couldn't be cast aside, even by thinking of the months since Dick had been the lone passenger on her first Bermuda flight. He had griped about his paper sending him down to do a series of articles on the honeymoon paradise, and she had griped about being frozen on the honeymoon paradise run for a month. The next day he'd been at the terminal to meet her flight, and he'd been meeting it every day since. But this was her last Bermuda trip, and next week Dick's assignment would be finished. He'd be back in New York, and they'd spend some lovely evenings making up for all the crowded hours at Kindley Field. What had Dick meant yesterday when he confided he thought he had stumbled onto a really big story? She felt a hand on her shoulder, turned, and was in Dick's arms. His kiss was urgent, brief, and fierce. "Jen, darling." It was the first time he had called her darling, but it seemed right and natural. "Listen as carefully as you've ever listened in your life, because you've got to get this straight. Here." He handed her a rolled-up copy of a magazine. "Stuff this in your pocketbook and get it to my newspaper tonight. Go to the office, 5th floor, and ask for Bill Ryan, the night editor." "Bill Ryan, 5th floor," Jen replied. "But," Dick cut her short, "I'll check with operations. 15 minutes after they tell me your flight has landed, I'll call Ryan and tell him what to expect. Jen, I'm putting you in danger, but I can't help it." "What danger, Dick?" He hesitated. "You've certainly got a right to know. Jen, remember that carrier that vanished at the end of the Korean War? The papers were full of it." Jen nodded soberly. "A boy I knew was on it." "That ship was sabotaged, but over 700 men escaped and were taken prisoner. Their names, serial numbers, and the prison camps they've been sent to are listed in that magazine. The Reds would kill rather than see that list printed." The loudspeaker in the terminal came on. The clear, precise British voice that never seemed hurried requested all passengers to assemble at Gate 2 for Federal Airlines Flight 401 non-stop to Idlewild. The announcement gave Jen a moment to think. How Dick had managed to get this magazine she didn't know, but obviously someone knew he had it. Otherwise, he'd be taking it to New York himself. "Do you think you were followed?" she whispered. Dick started walking her to the gate. "I may have lost the car that was tailing me, but I don't know how many of them know I have this. I've signed up for the late New York flight to throw them off." They stopped at the gate. Dick kissed her quickly, then reached into his wallet and pulled out a ring. "Jen, they may try to search me somehow. I bought this to give you in New York, but take it now. It will be safer with you." Jen stared down at the solitaire diamond set in a narrow platinum band. An engagement ring, 5 minutes late. When Dick trusted her with the magazine, he had told her he loved her and needed her. "In a few days I'll make the conventional speech," he promised. She slipped the ring into an inside pocket of her uniform jacket, put a hand on his shoulder, kissed him, then raced across the field, up the ramp, and onto the plane. Alan Bates, the purser, was standing by the door, ready to close it. "For Pete's sake, Jen," he snapped. "Captain Evans is having a fit. We're 2 minutes behind schedule. You make the announcements while I give cabin secure. You better not go near the flight deck till the skipper calms down." Jen caught her breath, straightened her cap, and turned on the mic. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard. We are flying non-stop to Idlewild Airport. Our anticipated flight time is 3 hours and 25 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts and do not smoke until the sign over the galley door goes off. Push the buzzer at your seat any time you want us. And a pleasant trip, everyone." She snapped off the mic, pulled the reserve sign off the flight service seat, and sat down. Alan joined her just before takeoff. He stared out the window as Jen leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Her shoulder bag dug into her side, and she ran her fingers over it, thinking that she'd have to hide the bag immediately. Dick's warning that she might be followed rang in her ears, and she tapped Alan's arm. He turned from the window and bent his head to catch her question. "Did anyone sign for the flight just before takeoff?" Alan nodded. "The ground rep first gave me a manifest with 8 names. 30 seconds later, he came tearing out with an amended manifest with 3 extra packs." He reached in his pocket. "Here's a copy." Jen's eyes skimmed quickly down the sheet. 2 Mr. and Mrs. They would be the honeymoon couples up front. 4 women's names. That would be the 4 ladies traveling together who'd been telling her at the airport what a lovely time they had in Bermuda. And here they were, the last 3 names. Hastings, Walter, seat 6. Clinton, Andrew, seat 9. Carlson, August, seat 18. Jen shut her eyes. If Dick had been followed, someone might have seen him pass the magazine to her. Someone may have signed up for the flight at the last minute to get the magazine back from her. But which one? Alan touched her arm. "Signs off, Jen. Suppose you give the skipper a cup of coffee. I'll pass out the newspapers." Jen went forward to the galley, carefully shut the door between it and the cabin. Being in the tiny galley, situated between the cabin and the flight deck, gave her a chance to think. She reasoned that if she hid her purse here, no passenger could possibly get at it without being noticed at once. If she prepared the dinner and Alan did the serving, she'd be able to guard the purse for almost the whole flight. Still, she'd better hide the bag well, in case anyone tried to slip in and search for it. She rejected the grocery closets as being too convenient, bent down, and opened the door of the narrow, dark refrigerator. On the bottom shelf of the refrigerator, almost level with the floor, were rows of various salads. She carefully reached the purse in and wedged it behind them. Satisfied that it was out of sight, she straightened up and closed the refrigerator door. The satisfaction vanished when she noticed that the oil from one of the salads had made an ugly stain on her sleeve. She dabbed at it with a paper napkin, making it worse, and decided to forget it. Remembering the captain was waiting for coffee, she got out a cup, drew coffee from the tank, shook 2 lumps of sugar into it, then went forward to the flight deck. "Hot, sweet, and black, Captain," she said, trying to make her voice light. Evans would not respond. He looked at her, his usually pleasant face firm, his eyes cold. "Jen, I've been flying 20 years, and one thing I've never tolerated is a member of my crew holding up a flight. I'm sorry, but I intend to write you up for this. If that was your boyfriend in the terminal, he looks like a nice young fellow, but no matter what he had to say, it wasn't important enough to hold up the plane." It was important enough, Jen thought, but she said, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize how late it was." Alan was in the galley mixing cocktails when she returned. He thrust the small notebook in which he had scribbled the orders into her hand. "Finish these up, will you? I'll go back and try to do a little paperwork." Jen nodded. Preparing the cocktails would give her a chance to keep a watchful eye on the galley, and serving them would be an opportunity to study the passengers, especially the latecomers. She finished making the drinks, went into the cabin, and glanced at the notations Alan had made. Bending over the honeymooners in the first seats, she offered the tray. "I believe you wanted daiquiris?" They had been having a low, earnest conversation and looked up, startled. "Oh, thank you." The girl reached up, colored, and withdrew her hand as her husband took 2 glasses from the tray and offered her one with a slight ceremony. Jen smiled. Bermuda might not be a bad place to go if you drank cocktails on the plane instead of serving them, and if you held hands with a brand-new husband. This boy was nice-looking, she thought, But Dick, with his curling brown hair, easy smile, and nonchalant air, was much more exciting. A tap on her shoulder quenched the flow of her happy ever-after thoughts. The first officer was beside her, saying, "Jen, the captain says you should send the passengers up to see the flight deck." Jen stared at him dismayed. She'd forgotten that Captain Evans invariably invited the passengers forward. Now every passenger in the plane would go through the galley. But if she finished serving the cocktails at once and made some motions of starting dinner, she could guard the purse while passengers went through. The honeymooners stood up eagerly. "Could we be the first?" the boy asked. The first officer answered for Jen. "Sure, come on." He started into the galley, and they rose and followed behind. Jen passed the rest of the cocktails rapidly. A warning was tingling through her nerves, hammering at her brain. She had to get back to the galley. The four women traveling together accepted the cocktails and gushed their thanks. At last the tray was empty. Jen dropped it flat against her side and started forward just as Alan called to her. She went to the rear of the plane where he was working at the small panel that served as a desk. "Jen, I can't find the extra baggage decks. They're not in the briefcase anywhere." Jen set down the tray and bent over the briefcase. "They were in this compartment when we were coming down this morning." She glanced up ahead frantically, knowing it was no use trying to leave Alan until the declarations were found. The honeymooners had returned, and the first officer was starting back toward the flight deck with the other young couple. Next time up, he'd be taking the 3 single men. Impatiently, Jen shook all the papers out of the briefcase and spent agonizing minutes going through them. The declarations weren't there. She started to jam the papers back in the briefcase, but was stopped by Alan's sharp, "Cut it out, Jen. Put those papers back straight. I'm fouled up as it is." By the time she had the briefcase filled, the first officer was escorting the second young couple back to their seats. She watched, holding her breath, as he invited the 3 latecomers up forward together. She glanced at Alan's sulky face and did not dare leave him. He met her look. "Try my topcoat, will you? Maybe I stuck them in my pocket." Jen hurried to the closet, fished for Alan's coat, found it, and raced through the pockets. In the inside one, she found the missing declarations. She dropped them on his lap. "Here they are." "That's a relief. Just read off the list of passengers to me and I'll see if I have all the declarations. Then we can start dinner." Wanting to strangle him, Jen went down the names. When she finally finished, the group of 4 women were returning from the flight deck. Every passenger in the plane had gone through the galley now. As Jen raced up the aisle, she was stopped by one of the women. "Isn't it a little careless, miss, to leave all those doors open in the galley? I ruined my stocking on the refrigerator handle." Jen stared at her, hurried forward to the galley, and slammed the door between it and the cabin. The galley was a mess. Every cabinet door was open. Groceries had tumbled into the sink, and the pocketbook she had left in the refrigerator was lying open on the countertop. She didn't need to look in it to know that the magazine with the lists was gone. She stumbled to the counter, feeling sick, and ran her fingers numbly over her purse, trying to think. Someone had managed a hurried search of the galley and had found her pocketbook in the refrigerator. Whoever had done it knew she would be aware the papers were missing and would be doubly careful not to draw suspicion on himself. Mechanically, she began to straighten up the galley, then reached for the manifest in her pocket. It had to be one of the 3 latecomers, Walter Hastings, Andrew Clinton, or August Carlson. Maybe Bill, the first officer, had noticed if any of them didn't follow him through to the flight deck. The flight was getting rougher. Jen steadied herself against the navigator's table as she went forward. Bill was just leaving his seat in the cockpit. He smiled at her and said, "It was hardly worth dragging those people up for the minute they stood here. The captain got word we're heading into rough weather, so he told me to get them in and out fast. I think I overdid it, though. The last time I left the men up here and started back to get the 4 women. We all met in the galley, and believe me, we didn't fit." Jen turned away without speaking. If Bill had left the men alone, It was useless to question him about who might have dropped back. She would have to depend on herself to find the thief, and she had little time to do it. The plane tipped and she steadied herself against the door. She closed her eyes, and Dick's face came into her mind, and in sharper focus, his look when he gave her the magazine. Remember that carrier that vanished at the end of the Korean War? Jen choked back a sob. Dick, she thought, you put your life in danger for those papers. You trusted me with them, and less than an hour after you gave them to me, I've lost them. There wouldn't be any headlines for the families of those boys to pour over tomorrow morning and end forever their doubt and despair. She had taken care of that. But she couldn't let them down. Not Dick, not all those people, not all those boys whose plight, if positively known, might be solved somehow. She had to recover the lists, and she had 2 hours to do it in. Impatiently, she rubbed the tears from her eyes. Hastings, Clinton, Carlson. She tried to reconstruct her impressions of each man when she had served them cocktails. Hastings in seat 6. Tall, thinnish, gray hair, mustache, eyeglasses, about 53. He'd been deep in the financial section of the Times and hadn't heard her when she offered the drink. Then he'd laughed and apologized. Whenever I squeeze in a vacation, I never look at the paper. But the minute I start home, I have to begin catching up. Jen recalled her impression that he was the executive type, completely at home on a plane. Clinton had had a Manhattan. He had thanked her for it and sipped it quickly, saying, "I can use this. I just got word my father had a heart attack last night." The scion of the family, Jen decided. Very good-looking in a tanned blonde way, handsomely dressed in a lightweight blue suit and an expensive-looking tie. He looked young, about 25, like an Ivy League graduate who had a station wagon and a Jaguar side by side in his garage. Carlson, a dark, stocky man about 42, seemed ill at ease on the plane and shyly explained he'd been visiting his son, who worked in one of the Bermuda hotels. Jen dug her nails into her fists, thinking they all seemed so right, so typical of what they claimed to be. The businessman, the well-to-do son, the grocery clerk. But one of them was lying. Which one? The cabin door opened and she stepped aside to make room for Alan. He was looking much happier now that the paperwork was finished. "Jen, suppose you work the galley this time and I'll serve the dinners. If you're really serious about that reporter, you might as well get some experience tossing meals together. There's no trick to carrying trays." Jen debated swiftly. She had to serve the dinners. If she spent the next hour or more in the galley, she'd never get a chance to find out who had the magazine. She searched for a plausible excuse to give Alan and could find nothing better than a headache. She rubbed her forehead. "Alan, would you mind awfully taking over the galley? My head is splitting. I'll make it up to you next time we have a flight together." Alan looked concerned. "Sure, kid. It doesn't matter to me. You don't look so hot at that. If you want to lie down in the bunk for a while, I can handle the meal." "Oh, no. I just can't handle the galley. But it's sweet of you to suggest it." Alan patted her shoulder. "I'm a very accommodating fellow. But then I've always had a weakness for brunettes. You know, Jen, newspaper reporters are very undependable fellows. They haven't got half as much to offer as pursers. Or is this speech too late?" Jen smiled. "It's too late for one thing, and you don't mean it for another." Alan put on his rueful look, and Jen knew what was coming. Alan fancied himself a connoisseur of women and a sought-after man about town. She had to get away. The flight deck door into the galley opened, saving her. Bill handed in the flight chart. "Here you are, kids. Show the folks where we are." Jen grabbed it from him. "I'll bring it around." She darted into the cabin before Alan could stop her. She started with the honeymooners, making the conventional speech. "Perhaps you'd like to see the flight chart. This shows our course, the speed we're flying at, our altitude, and the rate of the tailwinds. The X on the chart indicates our present position." She could have asked them to pass it back to the other passengers when they glanced at it, but instead she waited, every nerve trembling, eager for the moment she would bring it to the 3 men. Handing it to Walter Hastings, the middle-aged executive, she studied him anxiously as he looked it over. The only piece of luggage he had brought into the cabin was a briefcase, now lying unzippered at his feet. Some papers from it were on his lap. The magazine with the lists might very well be in the briefcase, but if they were, would he be daring enough to have the bag open? Or, if he were guilty, was he playing the busy banker plunging back into work? He handed her back the chart with a murmured thank you. She moved on to Andrew Clinton. He shook his head when she tried to hand him the chart. "No thanks, I'll take your word for it." He lit a cigarette and offered her one. She refused and he nodded. "That's right, you girls aren't supposed to smoke on duty, are you?" His eyes were blue with little brown spots near the pupil. He was attractive, Jen decided, liking the smart cut of his suit, the well-creased trousers that had survived the hot Bermuda afternoon, his immaculate white shoes. Once she'd chided Dick about a rumpled suit he was wearing, and he'd told her he thought it gave him a boyish appeal. Jen snapped back to reality. She had to probe this young man somehow, try to get a feeling about him. She remembered his father was supposed to be ill with a heart attack. "You must be terribly concerned about your father." He nodded. "I keep thinking if I'd paid a little more attention to the business, he'd have taken the vacation instead, and this wouldn't have happened. But I shouldn't bore you with my troubles." "You're not boring me at all," Jen replied. "But try not to worry so much. It probably isn't half as bad as the telegram sounded." She continued down the plane. Another blank, she thought. The solicitous son blaming himself for taking a vacation while his father works himself to death. She glanced back, noticing a small zipper bag, the kind the airline passed out to passengers in the overhead rack at Andrew Clinton's seat. She wondered, if he had the magazine, would he dare put the bag on the rack? She shook her head in despair. He and Hastings both seemed so on the level. Maybe Carlson. She was before him, offering the flight chart. He was a swarthy man, with a heavy-looking suit and brightly shined shoes. He looked bewildered at the chart, but when she explained, he reached for it eagerly. "My son knows all about these things. He works at the Princess Hotel. He's going to be a head waiter there someday." He placed the flight chart on his knees, reached into his pocket, awkwardly drew out an ancient wallet, and produced a picture of a younger edition of himself. "That's how he looks in uniform." Jen glanced at the picture. "He looks just like you." Pride made the little man sit straighter. "That's what everybody says. You know, he sent me money for this trip. He wrote me a letter." The letter was produced. "Papa, close up the store and come down for 2 weeks. This place is paradise." The letter and picture were put away. The flight chart was back in Jen's hand. Another apparent blank. This passenger had an ancient-looking black bag that stuck out from under his seat. Maybe the lists were concealed there, and his uncomfortably proud air was an act. But more likely, Jen thought, the bag contained inexpensive souvenirs for his friends back home. She quickly finished passing the chart to the other passengers, then went to the water tank and drew a glass of water. Time was going by. Every turn of the propellers was bringing the plane nearer to New York, and she still had no suspicion of which of the 3 men had stolen the magazine. Dick's face haunted her. And all those nameless people whose boys had been on that carrier seemed to be standing around her accusingly. She wanted to shout, "Please, God, help me." She gulped down the water and looked forward. Alan had opened the top half of the galley door, making a serving table of the bottom half for the dinner trays. Jen went back to the lounge, combed her hair, brightened her lipstick, and washed her hands. She stared in disgust at the smear on her sleeve that the salad in the refrigerator had caused. Then her expression changed from annoyance to fascination to excitement. She remembered that she'd been very careful to keep her arm well above the salad when she hid the purse, and yet she'd still stained her sleeve. Whoever had searched for her purse had only an instant to pull it out and grab the papers. Whoever had done that hadn't time to be careful, and might very well have stained his sleeve too. It was a slim chance, a pitiful hope, but it was the first tangible clue that had been offered her. Hastings, the banker, had taken his jacket off and folded it under the papers he'd scattered about him. Had there been a reason for that? Andrew Clinton had offered her a cigarette with his left hand on the armrest. Was it because he was aware of a stained sleeve that would have been out of place in his trimly elegant appearance? Carlson had dropped the flight chart on his lap when he dug for his wallet. Wouldn't it have been more natural just to hold it in his hand and reach for the wallet with his other hand? Jen hurried out of the lounge, clicking the door shut behind her decisively. One way or another, she had to see the bottom part of the jacket sleeves of all three men. A steaming tray was perched on the bottom part of the galley door. Alan was ready with dinner. She raced up the aisle and grabbed the tray. Alan's bantering humor was gone. He looked up from the oven where he was pulling out sizzling dinners and snapped in a low voice. "For heaven's sake, what's eating you this trip? You know this stuff turns to mush if it gets cold, but you vanish just when I'm getting ready with dinner." Jen quickly started passing the trays. When she came to Hastings, the papers were no longer in sight. His briefcase was closed at his seat, and he was wearing his jacket. He reached up both hands for the tray, and there was no trace of a stain on either sleeve. He was the well-bred executive who'd tidied up for dinner. Jen was flustered. If her hunch was correct, she could eliminate Hastings from her list of suspects. Andrew Clinton was next, but when she offered him the tray, he shook his head. "No thanks," he said. "I couldn't eat a thing." Helplessly, Jen passed the tray to one of the four women who said, "This looks simply delicious." It was Carlson's turn. He reached for his tray with his right hand. Jen could see the underneath part of that sleeve, and it was unblemished. She started to turn away, then said, "Oh, dear, I think your coffee spattered. I hope you didn't stain your sleeve." Reaching down, she pulled his left hand up and examined his sleeve closely. Another blank. Going forward to the galley, Jen served trays to the crew. If her hunch was right, it had to be Andrew Clinton, Jr., the would-be solicitous son who'd stolen the papers. She finished with the crew and prepared a small tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee, a small sugar bowl, and a cream pitcher. Clinton was staring out the window and turned, startled when she dropped down beside him. She made her eyes innocent. "I know coffee will make you feel better," she smiled. "And maybe talking to someone will take your mind off things. If you don't object, I'll have my coffee with you." There was nothing he could do but accept her offer. She noticed that he carefully reached for the coffee with his left hand, sliding his right hand into his lap and refusing cream and sugar. Either he likes it black, she reasoned, or he doesn't want to raise his other hand to get the cream. She began chattering to him aimlessly. She loved London. Had he ever been there? Night flying was always exciting somehow. Then she broke off. "Isn't that a perfectly gorgeous cloud bank?" He looked up as she pointed with the hand that held her coffee. Deliberately, she tilted the cup so that a few drops spilled on his right hand. With a curse, he pulled his hand out of the way, then dropped it on his knee again. But not before Jen had seen the stain on the underneath part of his right sleeve. "I can't let him know that I know." The thought flashed through Jen's mind, warning her that he'd destroy the papers rather than risk carrying them if he was sure she'd traced them to him. She ignored his sleeve, pulled out her handkerchief, and gently patted his hand. "I'm so terribly sorry." It wasn't hard to stammer the words, make her voice breathless. She glanced at his face. His eyes were angry, calculating, but as she continued apologizing, they relaxed and became disarming. "It's really nothing," he said. "Please don't be so upset." "You're awfully nice," she said. "I'm all thumbs." Don't hold it against the airline, please. She started collecting the empty dinner trays on her way forward. The relief at having located the person carrying the papers drained away as she realized the worst was still facing her. How to get them back. The magazine had to be in the small airline bag in the rack over Clinton's seat. Mechanically, she dumped the trays in the galley and came back for more. If Clinton was sure of himself, she might be able to catch him off guard. But how? If Dick were here, he'd know what to do. Dick. Just the thought of his name brought comfort, joy. "In a few days, I'll make the conventional speech," he said. Would he make that speech if she failed him when he needed her so badly? She brought the last trays up to the galley. Alan had finished tidying up, was tossing the garbage into refuse bags. "Hey, Jen," he inquired, giving a final wipe to the gleaming counters. "Did you do any shopping at the field? I've got to get the declaration ready for customs." Customs. Jen clutched at the word. Was there any way she could recover the magazine in customs? It was the only place Clinton would have to open his bag. How could she work it so he'd be tied up there? She remembered the ring Dick gave her. He must have forgotten that she'd have to declare it. She didn't want Alan to know she had an engagement ring. He'd be sure to tell the crew, and she couldn't be bothered with that now. "I did pick up something," she told him. "Leave me a declaration, will you?" "Sure thing." Alan pulled one out of his pocket. "But how you can do any shopping 2 days before payday, I'll never know." Jen went back to the cabin, sat in the crew seat, and started to fill out the declaration. 1 diamond ring, value... She stopped, her pen poised. She didn't know what the ring was worth. She had no sales slip for it. She'd probably be in a mess trying to explain it. An idea began in her mind and made her slowly put the pen away and rip up the declaration. It was a far-fetched chance, a desperate chance, the only chance. She went back to the clothes closet and found a light trench coat marked 9. Andrew Clinton's coat. Slowly, she slipped it off the rack. The buzzer sounded just as she finished. A drink of water for one of the ladies, then another. Alan came back from the galley. 5 minutes to go, Jen. Better start passing out the coats. She passed them out in a daze, trying to flash her mind ahead. Her timing had to be exact. One hint to Clinton and she'd be sunk. Again she longed fiercely for Dick's presence. He'd be able to handle this so much better. Jen, darling. If she failed him, would he ever say that again? She gave the short boxy coats to the women, a light covert cloth to Hastings, the tan trench coat to Andrew Clinton. She stood over him, quickly dropping the coat folded on the empty seat beside him. The bag, she noticed, was securely under his arm. She said, "How's your hand, Mr. Clinton? Does it hurt?" "Not at all, and you've been very kind. I'm beginning to feel my father will be all right." "I'm glad. Uncertainty is awful, isn't it?" She bit her lip, knowing her words had double meaning. The seatbelt sign was flashing. Far below, the lights of New York gleamed brilliantly, their outline familiar and welcoming. Jen turned on the mic. "Please fasten your seatbelts for the landing and extinguish your cigarettes. We've enjoyed having you aboard. We hope you've had a pleasant flight, and we'd love to see you soon again." She slid into the last seat, Alan beside her. 10 minutes more, and she'd have some idea whether the families of those boys would have news about their sons in the morning. Alan nudged her. "Let's go, kid. And may I say, this is the damnedest trip I've flown with you? You've been in a fog all afternoon." He opened the outside door, and the sharp April wind blew in, making a memory of the warm Bermuda sun. Jen led the passengers down the ramp and across the field. The customs room was bright, bare-looking, and empty except for the tired, bored men behind the desk. They barely glanced at the crew's bags and waved them on. Jen stood back after she handed in a blank declaration, making a production of putting on her coat and hat, delaying her exit. Hastings was the first passenger to clear. The customs man opened his bag, patted the clothes in it, and snapped it shut. Andrew Clinton was next. He gave a side glance to Jen and smiled at the customs official. "I've only got a change of underwear and my shaving kit. I've been called home because of illness. My bags will follow later." The inspector unzipped his bag and pulled out the contents. A shaving kit fell onto the counter, followed by the magazine. Jen stared at the magazine. Clinton casually reached his hand to cover it. She had to make her move now. "Why don't you tell them about the diamond ring in the lining of your overcoat, Mr. Clinton?" she inquired. He whirled at her, his face beet red. "What diamond ring?" The customs inspector didn't look bored anymore. His eyes pierced Clinton, then sought Jen. She looked at him squarely. "I loaned Mr. Clinton that magazine," she explained. "He didn't care about any we had on the plane. When I went to get it, I noticed him studying a diamond ring. I knew he hadn't declared it, and I saw him slit a hole in the pocket of his raincoat with his razor and slip the ring into the lining." Clinton had raised his hand from the magazine. Jen snatched it as the customs men restrained him. She turned and fled as she heard one of them say to him, "Look, buddy, don't take it out on the girl. You should know better than to try to beat the duty." The elevator in the Globe building stopped at the 5th floor. Jen stepped out and was grabbed by the shoulders. A man with iron-gray hair and a ruddy, worry-ridden face was staring at her. "Have you got the list?" She nodded faintly. He dropped his hands and reached for the magazine as she held it out. "Thank God. Dick's on the phone from Bermuda. He's been holding the line open for the last half hour, worried sick. He says you were definitely followed. Did you have any trouble?" "Is Dick still on the phone?" Jen asked. The man pointed to a telephone with the receiver lying on the desk. "Over there." He himself raced to an office boy. "Tell Charlie to reset the first 2 pages." Jen picked up the open receiver weakly, whispering Dick's name. From far away, she could hear his answer. "Jen, darling, I've never been so scared in my life. Are you all right?" "It was pretty bad, but everything's all right, Dick. I gave the lists to your editor." 1,000 miles away, she could hear his drawn-out sigh. "Darling," he said, "put on the ring right now. There isn't going to be any conventional speech. I'm not giving you a chance to give it back." The ring, blue-white prisms of light. Jen felt hot tears on her cheeks. "Dick, I've lost the ring. It was the only way. It was that or the lists." She felt the phone being taken from her. The editor was speaking into it. "Hop the next plane back, Dick. We'll all go shopping for a new one." Carol shivered inside her smoke-blue uniform coat and tried to ignore her growing uneasiness. As she glanced around the waiting room of the air terminal, she thought that the gaily dressed peasant dolls in the showcases made an incongruous background for the grim-faced policeman who passed in front of them. The handful of boarding passengers watching the policeman were standing together, their eyes full of hatred. As she walked toward them, one of the passengers was saying, "The chase is taking too long. The hunters are not pleased." He turned to Carol. "How long have you been flying, stewardess?" 3 years, Carol answered. "You look too young for even that length of time. But if you could have seen my country before it was occupied, this room was always full of gaiety. When I returned to America from my last visit, 20 relatives came to see me off. This time no one dared come. It isn't wise to make a public display of one's American connections." Carol lowered her voice. "There are so many more policemen today than usual. Do you know why?" "A member of the underground has escaped," he whispered. "He was spotted near here an hour ago. They'll surely catch him. But I hope I don't see it." "We'll be boarding the plane in 15 minutes, Carol answered reassuringly. "Excuse me, I must see the captain." Tom had just come in from the operations office. He nodded when his eyes met hers. Carol wondered how much longer it would be before her heart stopped racing painfully at every glimpse of him, before she stopped being so aware of his splendid tallness in the dark uniform. She reminded herself sternly that it was time she regarded him as just another pilot, not as the man she had loved so dearly. She spoke to him, her gray eyes veiled, non-committal. "You wanted me, Captain?" Tom's tone was as businesslike as her own. "I was wondering if you checked Paul." Carol was ashamed to answer that she'd not thought of the purser on the flight since they'd landed in Danubia an hour before. Sick from the effect of booster shots, Paul had stayed in crew bunk while the plane was refueled for the return flight to Frankfurt. "I haven't, Captain. I've been too interested in the hide-and-seek our friends are playing." She inclined her head in the direction of the police. Tom nodded. "I'd hate to be that poor guy when they catch him. They're positive he's on the field somewhere." For a moment, Tom's voice was familiar, confidential, and Carol looked at him eagerly. But then he became the captain speaking to the stewardess again. "Please go aboard and see if Paul needs anything. I'll have the ground rep bring the passengers out." "Right, Skipper." And she walked toward the entrance to the field. The cold airport seemed desolate in the half-darkness of the October evening. 3 policemen were entering the plane next to hers. The sight of them made her shiver as she boarded her plane and went forward to find Paul. He was asleep, so she gently placed another blanket over him and came back to the cabin. 10 minutes more and they'll all be aboard, she thought, checking her watch. She pulled out her hand mirror and ran a comb through the short blonde hair that curled from under her overseas cap. Just then, she realized with a drenching fear that the mirror was reflecting a thin hand grasping the pole of the small open closet behind her seat. Someone was trying to hide in the tiny recess there. She glanced frantically out the seat window for help. The police detachment had left the next plane and was heading in her direction. "Put away that mirror, mademoiselle." The words were quiet, the English clear, the accent a heavy undertone. She heard the hangers being pushed aside. She whirled and faced a thin boy of about 17 with heavy blonde hair and intelligent blue eyes. "Please, do not have fear. I will not harm you." The boy glanced out the window at the rapidly approaching police. "Is there another way off this plane?" Carol's fear changed swiftly. It was for him now that the feeling of disaster swept her. His eyes were frightened and he backed away from the window like a trapped animal. Beseeching, urgent, his hand stretched toward Carol, his voice imploring. "If they find me, they will kill me. Where can I hide?" "I can't hide you," Carol protested. "They'll find you when they search the plane, and I can't involve the airline." She had a clear picture of Tom's face if the police discovered a stowaway on board, especially if she were concealing him. Feet were ascending the ramp now, heavy shoes clanging on the metal. A loud series of bangs crashed against the closed door. Carol stared in fascination at the boy's eyes, at the black hopelessness in them. Frantically, she glanced around the cabin. Paul's uniform jacket was hanging in the clothes closet. She pulled it out and snatched his hat off the shelf. "Put these on, quick." Hope brightened the boy's face. His fingers raced at the buttons and he stuffed his hair under the cap. The banging at the door was repeated. Carol's hands were wet, her fingers numb. She shoved the boy into the rear seat, fumbled at the catch of the ship's portfolio, and scattered baggage declarations in his lap. "Don't open your mouth. If they ask me your name, I'll say Joe Reynolds and pray they don't check the passports." Her legs seemed too weak to carry her to the cabin door. As she pulled at the handle, the realization of what she was doing swept over her, and she thought how pitifully transparent the boy's disguise was. She wondered if she could possibly keep the police from searching the plane. The handle turned and the door swung open. She blocked the entrance and forced an annoyed tone as she faced the policeman. "The steward and I are checking our papers. What is the reason for this?" "Surely you're aware that a search is being made for an escaped traitor. You have no right to hinder the police in its work." "My work is being hindered. I'll report this to the captain. You have no right to enter an American plane." "We are searching every plane on the field," the leader snapped. "Will you step aside? It would be unpleasant to have to force our way in." Realizing it was no use to argue, Carol quickly sat on the seat next to the boy. Her body shifted towards him, her back shielding him from the direct view of the police. His head was bowed over the papers. In the dim light, his uniform was passable, and the absence of a tie was not noticeable in his hunched position. Carol pulled some declarations off his lap and said, "All right, Joe, let's get this finished. Kralik, Walter, 6 bottles cognac, value $30. 1 clock, value..." "Who else is aboard?" the leader asked. "The purser, who's asleep in the crew bunk," Carol said nervously. "He's been very ill." The Inquisitor's gaze passed over Joe without interest. "No one else? This is the only American plane here. It is the logical one for the traitor to head for." The second policeman had checked the lounges, the clothes set, and the floor under the seats. The third member of the party came back from the flight deck. "There's only one man here asleep. He is too old to be our prisoner." "He was spotted near here 15 minutes ago," the leader snapped. "He must be somewhere." Carol glanced at her watch. 1 minute to 8. The passengers must be starting across the field. She had to get rid of the police, hide the boy, in 1 minute. She stood up, careful to keep her body directly in front of Joe. By glancing out the opposite window, she could see the waiting room door opening. She said to the leader, "You've searched the plane. My passengers are about to board. Will you please leave?" "You seem strangely anxious to be rid of us, stewardess." "My paperwork isn't finished. It's difficult to do it while I'm tending the passengers." Steps were hurrying up the ramp. A messenger came in and said to the leader, "Sir, the commissioner wants an immediate report on the search." To Carol's relief, all 3 policemen scurried out. The ground representative and passengers were at the foot of the ramp as the policemen descended. The crew were entering the plane through the forward entrance. "Joe," Carol called. The boy was out of the seat, crouching in the aisle. Carol pulled him into the tail and pointed to the men's lounge. "In there. Take off the uniform and don't open the door for anyone except me." She stood at the cabin door and forced a smile at the ground rep and passengers. The ground rep handed her a manifest and waited while she greeted the passengers and showed them their seats. There were 6 names on the manifest. 5 were typed, and the last one, Vladimir Karlov, had been written in. Next to it were 4 letters, EXCO. "Extreme courtesy? Who's the VIP?" Carol asked the ground rep softly. "A real big shot. The commissioner of police in Danubia. He's one of their worst butchers, so handle him with kid gloves. He stopped to talk to the searching party about the escaped prisoner." The commissioner. On her flight. Carol felt sick, but as he climbed the ramp, she extended her hand, smiling. He was a tall man of about 50, with thin nostrils, tight lips. "I have been assigned to seat 42. Carol knew she couldn't let him sit in the rear of the plane. He'd be sure to see Joe when she brought him out of the lounge. "It's a beautiful flight to Frankfurt," she said, her smile easy. "It would be foolish not to sit in front of the wing." "I prefer a rear seat," he said. "It gives considerably smoother flight." "This hop is one of our smoothest runs. The front seats won't be bumpy and will give you a better view." The commissioner shrugged and followed her down the aisle. She glanced at the manifest and debated whether to seat him with another passenger. If she did, they might start a conversation, and he'd be less likely to look around when she brought Joe out of the lounge. But then, remembering the passenger's bitter comments about the search, she decided against it, led him to seat 3, placed his bag on the overhead rack, and told him to fasten his seatbelt. The passenger in seat 7 got up and started to walk to the rear. Carol caught up to him at the front of the men's lounge. "Sir, please take your seat. The plane is starting to move." The man's face was white. "Please, stewardess. I may be ill. I get a little frightened at takeoff." Carol took his hand and forced him to let go of the doorknob before he realized it was locked. "I have some pills that will help. Everyone must be in his seat until we're aloft." After she'd seen him seated, she snapped on the mic. "Good evening. I'm your stewardess, Carol Dowling. Please fasten your seatbelts and don't smoke until the sign over the forward door goes off. Our destination is Frankfurt. Our anticipated flight time, 2 hours and 5 minutes. A light supper will be served shortly. Please don't hesitate to ask for anything you want. A pleasant trip, everyone." When she went to the flight deck, the plane had stopped taxiing and the engines were thundering. She bent over Tom. "Cabin secure, Captain." Tom turned so quickly that his hand brushed against her hair. She felt a warm glow from the touch and unconsciously raised her hand to her hair. "Okay, Carol." The engines were racing. It was hard to catch his words. A year ago, he would have looked up at her and his lips would have formed, "Love you, Carol." But that was over now. She had an instant of fierce regret that they hadn't somehow made up their quarrel. On sleepless nights, she'd admitted to herself that Tom had tried. He'd made overtures, but she hadn't given an inch. So his attempts at making up had only ended in worse quarrels. And then he'd been stationed in London for 6 months, so they hadn't seen each other. And now they were on a flight together. 2 polite co-workers, giving no hint that things had ever been different. She started to turn back to the cabin, but Tom motioned her to wait. He nodded to the first officer and the engines became subdued. She felt an immense loneliness when he turned away from her. There had been a few moments on this flight when he'd seemed friendly, warm, moments when it looked as though they might be able to talk things through. But this will finish it, she thought. Even if I can get Joe to Frankfurt, Tom will never forgive me. Carol, did you speak to the commissioner yet? Just when I showed him his seat. He's not very chatty. Take good care of him. He's important. They're talking about closing Danubia to American planes. If he likes the service, it might help a little. I'll send Dick back to give you a hand with dinner once we're aloft. Don't. I mean, it's just a cold supper. With only 6 passengers, I can manage. Back in the cabin, she smiled reassuringly at the man afraid of takeoffs as she passed him. The plane had reached the runway, and the crescendo of engines was deafening. All the passengers, including the commissioner, were staring out the windows. She went back, tapped on the door of the men's lounge, and softly called to Joe. Noiselessly, he slipped out. In the dim light, his thin body seemed more like a shadow than a human creature. She put her lips to his ear. The last seat on the right. Get on the floor, I'll throw a blanket over you. He moved warily and disappeared into the seat recess. He walks like a cat, Carol thought. Or like a kitten, she amended, remembering the boyish fuzz that had brushed her face. It was hard to balance in the ascending plane, and steadying herself by one hand on the lounge bulkhead, she took the aisle seat by Joe, flipped a blanket from the overhead rack, and threw it over him, shaking it wide. To a casual glance, the blanket might not seem unusual. To a searching glance, it would be odd that anything so shapeless could make such a thick mound. She glued her eyes to the sign over the cabin door. Fasten your seatbelts, no smoking. Attachez vos ceintures, ne fumez pas. While the sign was on, she had a reprieve, a safe island. But when it flashed off, she'd have to turn on the bright cabin lights that would make a farce out of Joe's hiding place and let the passengers leave their seats. For the first time, she seriously considered what would happen to her for concealing Joe. She thought about what Tom would say and remembered unhappily his reaction last year when she'd caused trouble on his ship. But Tom, she'd protested, what if I did let that poor kid take her dog out of the crate? She was traveling alone to be adopted by strangers. It was night and the cabin was dark. No one would have known if that woman hadn't gone over to her and got nipped for her trouble. And Tom had retorted, Carol, maybe someday you'll learn to obey basic rules. That woman was a stockholder and raised Cain in the front office. I took the blame for letting the dog loose because I knew it wouldn't cost me my job. But after 10 years with a clean record, I don't like having a reprimand in my brief now. She recalled uneasily how she'd flared at him, telling him she was delighted he didn't have a perfect record to live up to anymore, that now maybe he'd relax and act human. Maybe he'd stop treating the company manual like the Bible. It wasn't hard to remember everything they'd said. She'd relived that quarrel so often. She tried to picture what Charlie Wright, Northern Station manager at Frankfurt, would do. Charlie was a company man, too. He liked the planes to arrive and depart on schedule, the passengers to be satisfied. Charlie would definitely be upset at having to report a stowaway to the front office and would undoubtedly suspend her immediately or fire her outright. Joe's blanket moved slightly, and her mind jolted back to the problem of finding a safe hiding place for him. The plane leveled off. As the seatbelt sign died, she rose slowly. Hating to do it, she reached for the switch on the bulkhead and turned the cabin lights from dim to bright. She started to pass out magazines and newspapers. The man who'd been nervous about takeoff was no longer strained-looking. That pill helped a lot, stewardess. He accepted a newspaper and fumbled for his glasses. They must be in my coat. He got up and started toward the rear. Carol said numbly, Let me get them for you. Not at all. He was passing Joe's hiding place, Carol following, scarcely breathing. The blanket was glaringly out of place in the tidy cabin. The passenger got his eyeglasses, started back down the aisle, and stopped. Carol swiftly reflected that this man was the neat type. hadn't he straightened his coat on the hanger, smoothed the edges of his newspaper? In just 1 second, he'd pick up that blanket. He was bending, saying, "This must have fallen." "Oh, please." Carol's hand was on his arm, her grip firm. "Please don't bother. I'll get it in a minute." She eased him forward, scolding lightly. "You're our guest. If the captain saw me letting you tidy up, he'd drop me out the window." The man smiled, but went amiably to his seat. Carol's eyes searched the cabin hopelessly. The blanket was too obvious. Any time someone went to the rear of the plane, Joe could be discovered. "Magazine, stewardess." "Of course." Carol brought a selection to the passenger seated behind the commissioner, then walked forward. "Would you care to see a magazine, Commissioner Karloff?" The commissioner's thin fingers were tapping the armrest, his lips pursed in concentration. "Some piece of information eludes me, stewardess. Something I have been told does not fit in. However," he smiled coldly, "it will come back to me. It always does." He waved away the magazine. "Where is the water fountain?" "I'll get you a glass of water," Carol said. He started to rise. "Don't bother, please. I detest sitting so long. I'll get it myself." The water fountain was opposite the seat where Joe was hiding. The commissioner was not a naive observer. He'd be sure to investigate the blanket. "No!" She blocked the way to the aisle. "The flight's getting bumpy. The captain doesn't want the passengers moving." The commissioner looked significantly at the unlighted seatbelt sign. "If you will let me pass." The plane tilted slightly. Carol swayed against the commissioner, deliberately dropping the magazines. It was getting rough. If she could just stall him, Tom was sure to flash the sign on. The commissioner, looking exasperated, picked up a few of the magazines. Still blocking his way, she slowly picked up the others, carefully sorting them by size. Finally, unable to delay any longer, she straightened up, and the seatbelt sign was flashing. The commissioner leaned back and studied Carol intently as she went to the tank, drew him a glass of water, and brought it to him. He didn't thank her, but instead observed, "That sign seemed like a direct answer to a plea of yours, stewardess. It must have been important to you that I did not leave my seat." Carol felt panic, then anger. He knew something was up, and it amused him to watch her squirm. She took his barely touched glass. "Sir, I'm going to let you in on a trade secret. When we have a very important passenger on board, a mark is made next to his name on the manifest. That symbol means we're to show every courtesy to that person. You're that passenger on this flight, and I'm trying to make your trip as pleasant as possible. I'm afraid I'm not succeeding." The flight deck door opened and Tom stepped down. The passengers were all seated near the front half of the cabin. Carol stood by the last one. The odds were that Tom merely wanted to say hello to them. He wouldn't bother going all the way through with no one seated in the back. Tom welcomed the commissioner, shook hands with the man behind him, pointed out a cloud bank to the two friends playing checkers. Carol studied his movements with vast aching. Every time she saw him, a different memory flashed back. This time it was Memorial Day in Gander, and their flight was canceled because of a freak snowstorm. Late that night, she and Tom had had a snowball fight. Tom had looked at his watch and said, "Do you realize in 2 minutes it will be June 1st? I've never kissed a girl in a snowstorm on June 1st before." His lips brushed her cheek and were cold, found her mouth and were warm. "I love you, Carol." It was the first time he had said it. Carol swallowed against the hurt and came back to reality. She was standing in the aisle, and Tom was before her, and Joe was in danger, and there was no way out. "Sure you don't want help with dinner, Carol?" His tone was impersonal, but his eyes searched hers. She wondered if he had flashes of remembering, too. "No need," she said. "I'll start on it immediately." It would mean going up to the galley and leaving Joe for anyone to discover, but... Tom cleared his throat and seemed to search for words. How does it feel to be the only woman on board, Carol? The words hung in Carol's mind for seconds before their full import sank in. She gazed from passenger to passenger. The commissioner, the man afraid of takeoffs, the mild 40-ish one, the elderly man sleeping, the two friends at checkers. Men. All men. She'd prayed for a hiding place for Joe, and Tom, of all people, had pointed it out. The ladies' lounge. Perfect. And so simple. Now, as Tom studied her, she said casually, "I love being the only woman here, Captain. No competition." Tom started to go forward and hesitated. "Carol, have coffee with me when we get to Frankfurt. We've got to talk." It had come. He missed her, too. If she said to him now, "I've discovered a stowaway on board," it would be so easy. Tom could take credit, and Danubia would be grateful. It might mean Northern's charter being extended and make up to him for last year's trouble. But she couldn't murder Joe, even for Tom's love. "Ask me in Frankfurt if you still want to," she said. After Tom had gone back to the flight deck, she returned to the seat beside Joe and studied the passengers swiftly. The checker game was absorbing the two players. The elderly man dozed. The 40-ish man watched clouds. The neat one was bent over his newspaper. The commissioner's head was leaning against the back of the seat. It was too much to hope he was napping. At best, he was in deep thought and might not turn around. She leaned over the blanketed form. "Joe, you've got to get to the rear of the plane. The ladies' lounge is on the left. Go in and lock the door." Just then, she met the commissioner's glance as he turned in his seat. "Joe, I've got to turn the lights off. When I do, get out of there fast. Do you understand?" Joe slipped the blanket from his head. His hair was tousled, and his eyes blinked in the strong light. He looked like a 12-year-old roused from a sound sleep. But when his eyes got used to the light, they were the eyes of a man, weary, strained. His faint nod was all Carol needed to assure her that he understood. She got up. The commissioner had left his seat and was hurrying toward her. It took her a second to cross to the light switch and plunge the cabin into darkness. Cries of alarm came from the passengers. Carol made her cries louder than the rest. "I'm sorry, how stupid of me. I can't seem to find the right switch." The click of a door closing. Had she heard it or merely wanted to hear it? "Turn on that light, stewardess." An icy voice, a rough hand on her arm. Carol threw the switch and stared into the face of the commissioner, a face distorted with rage. "Why?" His voice was furious. "Why what, sir? I merely intended to turn the microphone on to announce dinner. See, the mic switch is next to the lights." The commissioner studied the panel, uncertainty crossing his face. Carol turned the mic on. "I hope you're hungry, everybody. I'll serve dinner in minutes, and while you're waiting, we'll have a cocktail. Manhattans, martinis, or daiquiris. I'll be right there to get your orders." She turned to the commissioner and said respectfully, "Cocktail, sir?" "Will you have one with me, stewardess?" "I can't drink while I'm working." "Neither can I." What did he mean by that, Carol wondered, passing the cocktail tray. More cat-and-mouse stuff, she decided as she yanked prepared food from the cubbyhole refrigerator in the galley and made up trays. She took special pains with the commissioner's dinner, folding the linen napkin in creases and pouring the coffee at the last minute to keep it steaming hot. "Aren't there usually 2 attendants?" the commissioner asked as she placed the tray in front of him. "Yes, but the purser's ill. He's lying down." She served the others, poured second coffees, brought trays to the crew. Tom turned over the controls to the first officer and sat at the navigator's table. "I'll be glad when we get to Frankfurt," he said uneasily. "With this tailwind, we should be in half an hour. I've been edgy this whole flight. Something seems wrong, but I can't put my finger on it." He grinned. "Maybe I'm just tired and need some of your good coffee, Carol." Carol pulled the curtain from the crew bunk up slightly. "Paul certainly has been asleep for a long time. He just woke up and asked me to get his jacket. He wanted to give you a hand, but I made him stay put. He feels rotten." Joe's fate was hanging in such delicate balance. If Paul had come back, he'd have seen Joe. If Paul's jacket hadn't been hanging in the cabin, the police would have found Joe. If Tom hadn't said she was the only woman aboard. "I'll pick up the tray since we've only a half hour to go," she said. She started collecting the trays from the passengers, working her way forward. The commissioner's tray was untouched. He was staring down at it. A premonition warned Carol not to disturb him. She cleared and stacked the other trays. But then her wristwatch told her they'd land in 10 minutes. The seatbelt sign came on. She went for the commissioner's tray. "Shall I take it, sir? I'm afraid you didn't eat much." But the commissioner stood up. "You almost got away with it, miss. But I finally realized what's been eluding me. At Danubia, the search party said the purser was ill, and the stewardess was checking baggage declarations with the steward." His face turned cruel. "Why didn't the steward help you with dinner?" "Because there isn't any." His fingers dug into Carol's shoulder. "Our prisoner did get on this plane, and you've hidden him." Carol fought rising panic. "Let me go." "He is on board, isn't he? Well, it's not too late. The captain must take us back to Danubia. A thorough search will be made." He pushed her aside and lunged for the door to the flight deck. Carol grasped at his arm, but he flung her hand away. The other passengers were on their feet, staring. Her last hope was these men, who with bitterness had watched the search. Would they help? "Yes, there's an escaped prisoner on board," she shouted. "He's a kid you'd love to shoot, but I won't let you do it." For a moment, the passengers seemed frozen as they clutched seat backs for support in the sloping plane. Carol, in utter despair, thought they wouldn't help. But then, as though they totally understood what was going on, they lunged forward together. The mild one threw himself against the commissioner and knocked his hand from the doorknob. A checker player pinned his arms behind his back. The plane was circling the field, the airport lights level with the window. A faint bump. Frankfurt. The passengers released the commissioner as the flight deck door opened. Tom stood there, angrily taking in the scene. "Carol, what the devil is going on?" She went to him, shutting her eyes against the commissioner's hatred and against the impact of her words on Tom. She felt sick, drained. "Captain." Her tongue was thick. She could barely form the words. "Captain, I wish to report a stowaway." She gratefully sipped steaming coffee in the station manager's office. The past hour was a blur of airport officials, police, photographers. Only vivid was the commissioner's demand. "This man is a citizen of my country. He must be returned immediately." And the station manager's reply. "This is regrettable, but we must turn the stowaway over to the Bonn government. If his story checks, he'll be granted asylum." She stared at her hand where Joe had kissed it before being taken into custody. He'd said, "You have given me my life, my future." The door opened and Charlie Wright, the station manager, walked in, followed by Tom. "Well, that's that." He looked squarely at Carol. "Proud of yourself? Feeling real heroic and dying to see the morning headlines? Stewardess hides stowaway in thrilling flight from Danubia. The papers won't print that Northern won't be welcome in Danubia anymore and will lose a few million in revenue because of you. As for you, Carol, you can deadhead home and there'll be a hearing in New York. But you're fired." "I expected it. But you've got to understand Tom knew nothing about the stowaway." "It's a captain's business to know what's going on in his plane," Charlie shot back. "Tom will probably get away with a stiff call-down, unless he gets heroic and tries to take the blame for you. I heard from the grapevine he did that once before." "That's right," Carol said. "He took the blame for me last year, and I didn't have the decency to thank him for it." She looked into Tom's strangely inscrutable face. "Tom, last year you were furious with me, and rightly so. I was completely wrong. This time I'm truly sorry for the trouble you'll have over this. but I couldn't have done otherwise. She turned to Charlie, fighting tears. If you're finished, I'm going to the hotel. I'm dead. He looked at her with some sympathy. Carol, unofficially I can understand what you did. Officially... She tried to smile. Good night. She went out and started to walk down the stairs. Tom caught up with her at the landing. Look, Carol, let's put the record straight. I'm glad the boy got through. You wouldn't be the girl I love if you'd handed him over to those butchers. The girl I love. But thank God you won't be flying on my plane anymore. I'd be afraid to sit at the stick wondering what was going on in the cabin. His arm slipped around her. But if you're not on my plane, I wish you'd be there to pick me up at the airport. You can hide spies and dogs and anything you darn please in the back seat. Carol, I'm trying to ask you to marry me. Carol looked at him, the splendid tallness of him and the tenderness in his eyes. Then his lips were warm against hers, and he was saying again the words she'd wanted so long to hear. Love you, Carol. The waiting room of the terminal was dim and quiet. After a moment, they started down the stairs toward it, their footsteps echoing ahead.